Towards the end of the 1950s, Soviet planners wanted to replace the PT-76 with an updated amphibious tank providing better mobility and more firepower. There were about a dozen proposals for this, but most of them were just paper projects and very few actually got any steel cut. In 1960, approval was given to develop the Object 906 design into functional prototypes for testing under the designation PT-85. By mid-1963, half a dozen had been built with some minor variations between them to evaluate different radio kits, air filters, and other sub-assemblies, but all had the same basic design. It was outwardly similar to the PT-76, but the turret was a little further back, and it featured an autoloader that was quite advanced for the time. It was heavier than the PT-76 and also a bit longer, but it was mostly made out of aluminum alloy and it was still amphibious. It could ford rivers without any trouble, and it was tested for beach landings from a transport ship, but I couldn't find any info about the results of the beach tests. The biggest difference, however, was the armament. The Object 906 featured the auto-loading 85mm D58 cannon with a 2-axis stabilizer and a fume extractor. For its caliber, the D58 was a very high-performance weapon, but integration into the tank's small turret took almost half a year in order to get the thing working. Overall, the PT-85 received good marks and it passed state acceptance trials after a bunch of the minor issues were worked out, though it ended up being a victim of bad timing. Around the middle of the 1960s, Soviet doctrine was changing and the need for amphibious tanks had been replaced with a need for amphibious infantry fighting vehicles. The project was cancelled without entering service, and it represented the last amphibious conventional tank developed by the Soviet Union. Only one Object 906 prototype survives today. What we get in War Thunder is the Object 906, a light tank in the Soviet tech tree at battle rating 8.0. The 906 gets night vision, engine smoke, artillery drops, and target spotting, the usual light tank kit for this BR range. The armor profile on this tank is, frankly, kind of a joke. It's got 4mm of corrugated cardboard over basically the entire vehicle. Even light machine gun fire will pen the armor and kill your crew. More about that later. The gunner has a 7x optical zoom. Its main gun is the D58, a rifled cannon with an autoloader and a 2-plane stabilizer. With an ace crew, this thing has a reload rate of barely 4.3 seconds, which is just insane. This gives the Object 906 a well-deserved reputation for good firepower. For ammo, your main shot is going to be the BR-372 armor-piercing capped ballistic capped shell. This thing has a good flat trajectory, surprisingly good penetration for its caliber, and explosive filler. Now, when I first tried out the Object 906, my instinct was to go with the Heat FS, but over time I found the BR-372 to be significantly better, and now I generally only take a couple of Heat FS rounds for the occasional heavy tanks that you can get tiered into. I never bother with the HE shot. It also gets a coaxial 7.62mm machine gun. This isn't going to kill anything, but it's there, and it can help tag targets or clear out terrain fences and stuff like that. Driving the 906, frankly, is a bit of a treat. It's only got a 300 horsepower engine, but, again, it's made out of cardboard, so that's enough to give it 20 horsepower per ton. Plus, the transmission has 9 forward and reverse gears, letting this thing get over 70 kilometers an hour in either direction. Very rare for a Soviet vehicle. Plus, it generally turns well, and overall its mobility on land has basically only one snag. It just doesn't have any mass. Even light obstacles like stone walls or fence posts are pretty difficult to push through, and as much as I hate to say it, using your gun to blast down obstacles is pretty legit with this thing. Otherwise, no real hang-ups driving on land. On water, it's a different story. It can swim, But this thing is one of the longer amphibious vehicles in the game, and it does fine in mostly still water, but with even mild chop, it pitches all over the place and frequently drowns the crew. If you've been watching the channel for any length of time, you know that I'm a huge fan of amphibious tanks. But if I'm being honest, this one kinda let me down in terms of doing water stuff. Out of the very few maps in this BR range that actually have water features, all but one of them have enough chop to be a problem, and I don't really find as much opportunity to take the 906 swimming as I do with other amphibious vehicles. In fact, as I'm producing this video, this is the only amphibious tank I can think of that I don't actively seek out water features with. So make of that what you will. When it comes time to drive this thing into battle, it's actually a little more complicated than you might expect. Now, most of the time in ground battles, my comfort zone with light vehicles is to go out on wide flanks and try to set up for a good line of fire over a quadrant of the map. That still works with the 906, but it ends up being almost wasted potential. The flanking overwatch strategy works fine, and it's often pretty safe, but it usually doesn't rack up many points. Over time, I've found that using the incredible mobility of the 906 to shoot out ahead of the team at the start of a match and get into, like, kind of a troublemaker spot in the middle of the map is surprisingly effective. The fast reload and strong firepower with the main gun lets the 906 do pretty good area denial on more open maps, and if you get set up for this in a central high-traffic area, it's a really good recipe to rack up the kills pretty quickly. On more urban maps, or just maps with more complicated terrain, again, use the mobility to get out in front early and try to sneak in behind the enemy team. Scoot around behind the line of contact using the fast reload to pop off enemy tanks from the sides and rear, then relocate before people realize where you are firing from. It takes a little practice and it's kind of map dependent, but on a map like Sweden or Test Site 2271, if you get this thing roaming around in and out of side streets and alleyways behind the front line, the 906 becomes a powerhouse. That is, so long as you can get the jump on people. Hold that thought for a minute. Now, unlike most other light tanks, I actually use the Object 209 as a first spawn about 90% of the time. I take a T-54 as a backup and usually a BMP-1 or a lower tier SPAA as a third slot filler. For close air support, the Tu-14 or the Mi-8 are my usual picks. Gunnery with this tank is surprisingly easy, assuming you're using the AP shot. Reasonably flat ballistics trajectory, and it's pretty easy to aim with only minimal practice. The Heat FS round unfortunately has a lot of drop and it's entirely different to fire, so switching back and forth can be a little weird. The 7x optical zoom for the gunner isn't impressive, but it's good enough most of the time for short or medium range engagements. Visually, you get over a dozen different unlockable paint jobs for this thing, and in my opinion, it looks very futuristic for what it is. The 3D model is well done, and I really just love having this thing up on the screen. Now, before we wrap up, I want to tackle the elephant in the room. This thing is made of cardboard. I started the video by showcasing a nuke match, and now you're wrapping up on a 10-kill match. Both because everybody loves a good rampage, and these demonstrated the tactics and firepower I've been talking about fairly well. However, it isn't exactly representative of using this thing. I consider myself an average player, and I can't always evade getting shot at like I did in these matches, which is the problem for this tank. It has absolutely no armor, and it's highly vulnerable to the complete oversaturation of 30mm autocannons in this BR bracket, as well as just rooftop machine guns and coaxials on regular tanks. People don't even have to aim, just spray and pray in your general direction and they'll get through. Unfortunately, this leads to pretty low average survivability with the Object 906 in a lot of situations. For example, Closing out with the Object 906. This thing has excellent mobility, it's got incredibly strong firepower, it's amphibious, and it gets scout tank features. However, it's made out of cardboard. The final verdict on the Object 906 is that this thing is the quintessential glass cannon. If you can avoid getting shot at, it'll rack up huge kill totals. Though if somebody throws a tennis ball at it, you're back to hanger. As always, thanks for watching.